Hello, my name is Jouni Vilkka and this is my channel TFF Teacher from Finland. This video is the third and last part of my series on philosophy of life, all of which is part of my larger series Introduction to Ethics. See the playlist or the link below for more info on that. In this video I will talk about humanism, the Enlightenment, Romanticism and Existentialism. But first, as always, I ask you to consider subscribing to my channel and clicking the thumbs up button. In the previous two videos, I talked about the way philosophers in antiquity, especially the Hellenistic period, thought about philosophy of life. Now I'm skipping over the whole Middle Ages, when Christianity ruled European thinking. During that time, it was not realistically possible for philosophers to discuss a secular philosophy of life, separate from religion. Christianity was basically the only acceptable way of life. Even Jews were being persecuted from time to time. Some individual people with weird ideas could perhaps be tolerated, but not a whole school teaching something independently of the religious and secular authorities. Heretics were persecuted, tortured and killed, and that was just for having slightly different ideas about Christianity. Things were somewhat, but not much, better in Islamic areas. Philosophers teaching a way of life that would ignore what the religious authorities were teaching would not have been tolerated. Things began to change with the Renaissance, starting in Italy in the 14th century. The name of the period refers to the idea of the rebirth of classical culture. Renaissance humanists studied the humanities, meaning rhetoric, grammar, literature, and philosophy of antiquity, insisting on going to the original sources, ad fontes. They translated classical works of literature, while artists like sculptors and painters were recreating ancient works of art or creating new ones inspired by antiquity. Powerful city-states, especially in what is now known as Italy, even revitalized the idea of civic duty. Citizens could be seen as participants in society with the ability to influence, at least to some degree, the decisions made by their leaders. Religious orthodoxy began to be questioned, although usually not directly, and with many points obscured deliberately to avoid repercussions. Some were too outspoken for their own good. For example, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600. Several religious thinkers criticized the power and practices of the Catholic Church as well, creating the movement called Reformation, which eventually led to the creation of several churches independent of the Catholic Church. Of course, not without centuries of warfare. Of interest to us here, though, is that philosophical ideas from antiquity resurfaced, at least among the highly educated. For example, Michel de Montaigne wrote essays strongly influenced by the skepticism and humanism of antiquity. Perhaps inspired by the pre-Socratic natural philosophers, Francis Bacon importantly promoted a new scientific thinking, helping to usher in the scientific revolution. The ideas of classical humanism and of the rising new power of experimental science led to a new movement the 18th century is most known for, the Enlightenment. The most famous intellectual of that movement is François-Marie Arouet, known as Voltaire. It is with the Enlightenment that independent critical thinking and criticism of religion began to be more possible, with even open atheism finally becoming a possibility. Free thought, the intellectual movement that refuses to accept dogmas and dogmatic authorities, following only science and reason, entered the public consciousness. It was now possible for new ways of life at least to some degree, to exist free of the power of the churches. Most people, of course, were still religious, but from now on, more and more people would have to come to the realization that not everyone around them shared their religious beliefs, or those of the opposing church. Philosophy could be discussed in coffee shops and the salons of the rich and powerful, that is, in secular settings, outside of universities that were still dominated by religious authorities. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant now wrote about ethics, appealing only to reason instead of divine revelation. Eventually, even universities, for the most part, were secularized, with secularization spreading over the continent. Pure philosophy free of religious dogma could be studied and practiced in universities, as could all the sciences, natural and human. The modern secular world had arrived. All the different schools of thought, the debates between analytic and continental philosophies of the 20th century, for example, were now possible in this new context. A new philosophy of life that acknowledges this history and draws from it, or developed through this history, is called secular humanism. It is mostly seen as connected to the Enlightenment, with free thought being quite central to it. It also embraces scientific skepticism, which draws from the scientific advancement since the scientific revolution, but philosophically also from the Hellenistic school of skepticism. As a philosophy that sees no reason to accept claims about the supernatural, this new philosophy of life is necessarily humanistic, as the only perspective to ethics available to us is our human perspective. That said, it also acknowledges how connected we are to the rest of nature. All life on Earth, after all, is part of the same phenomenon, the same evolutionary continuum that started with the first organisms. In discarding religions and all other dogmatic systems as well, secular humanism puts the individual in charge of their own life and the meaning, purpose and goals they want to give that life. Because this is still a strange idea for many people around the world, if not in Europe, I will explain it briefly as follows. The idea that God gives our lives meaning or purpose makes no sense, unless we accept ourselves as similar to objects, such as tools. The claim that the maker of a tool gives it purpose might make some sense. Or the claim that I give purpose to the tools I own. But are you just a tool? I sure hope not. I certainly don't accept that I am anyone's tool or property. Neither should you. Thus, the meaningfulness or purpose of life has to come from within the individual in order to matter for that individual. A slave owner surely owns his slaves for a reason. He wants those slaves to work for him, but none of his slaves are likely to accept that work as the purpose for their own lives. Similarly, even if I were created by a god, I would not accept the purpose of that god for myself, as I refuse to be a mere tool. I have a mind of my own, and anyone with a mind needs to find their own purpose for themselves. A suggestion might be accepted. A command, not so much. Secular humanism is represented by many organizations around the world, such as Humanists International globally, the Council for Secular Humanism in the US, and both Humanistiliitto and Vapaa-ajattelijoiden liitto in Finland. For anyone interested in the subject, I recommend the magazine Free Inquiry, and for the very closely related topic of scientific skepticism, I recommend the magazine Skeptical Inquirer. Some easy-to-read books about secular humanism are Humanism, an Introduction by Jim Herrick, Affirmations, Joyful and Creative Exuberance by Paul Kurtz, and Meditations for the Humanist, Ethics for a Secular Age by A.C. Grayling. Secular humanism is such a broad term that most of present-day philosophy can easily fit under it, as long as no claims about the paranormal or supernatural are made, and the importance of the scientific worldview in general is accepted, of course. That is also why I will not discuss it further here, but I will perhaps return to the subject at some later point. For now, I just hope to have made the point that most contemporary academic thinking can be seen as secular humanistic thinking. It is simply where the best arguments lead, and there is no dogma you have to subscribe to in order to be accepted under the umbrella. I will now rewind a bit from the present day back to the 19th century. It has been called the century of Romanticism because of the emphasis on emotions, especially in literature and other arts. It was to a great extent a reaction against the emphasis on reason and science of the previous century, and the rapidly growing industrialization and capitalism that had started to take over the world. Nationalism is one and arguably the worst expression of Romanticism. It became a new ideological tool to motivate people to kill each other for an allegedly greater cause. Romanticism also influenced philosophy. By emphasizing personal experience and subjective emotions, as opposed to the common rationality of the Enlightenment, proponents of this movement include Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who will get no more than this mention for now. More influential for later centuries are Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, whose views on philosophy of life I will introduce briefly here. What is interesting about them, in my opinion at least, is how Romanticism gave way to existentialism. The philosophers considered to be the earliest existentialists are also typically listed as romantics. Arthur Schopenhauer, usually classified as a romantic and not an existentialist, has been called the philosopher of pessimism because he opposed the optimistic belief in ever-increasing knowledge and progress popular in his time. He was among the first Europeans to be significantly influenced by Vedic texts from ancient India. For him, life was irrational, full of contradictions and suffering, with few short moments of happiness. All that is caused by will, because it leads to conflict and wanting endlessly. Like Buddhists, he also suggested that the solution is to let go of one's ego by realizing one's fundamental unity with everything and everyone else, which requires a kind of epiphany or experience of enlightenment, I suppose. Schopenhauer also thought that aesthetic experiences like the appreciation of beautiful art can enable one to understand that all others are in the same situation, experiencing the same suffering of life, and that in turn can inspire one to compassion and to help others. As a philosophy of life, Schopenhauer's thinking clearly recommends the practice or at least appreciation of arts. Søren Kierkegaard, a romantic usually called the first existentialist, was focused on the personal point of view and the importance of the individual's life choices. A person choosing to live on an aesthetic level enjoys the pleasures of the senses, social life, and other such superficial things. Kierkegaard believed, because of his own life experiences, I presume, that such a way of life leads to frustration and an emptiness when nothing really feels like anything anymore. Because of the negative experiences, one may finally reach a higher ethical level, Kierkegaard thought. We might not call this level ethical because it seems to be more about accepting social norms, such as pursuing a career, creating a family, and in general, following the explicit and implicit rules of society. Eventually, according to Kierkegaard, this inauthentic life will begin to feel alien, as it is not the individual's own authentic expression. Time to reach a higher level. For Kierkegaard, the third and last level of this mental development, quite surprisingly, is the religious level, specifically Christian level. One might suspect that in thinking so, he may not really have left the level of social norms, but I digress. He believed that only this level provides a solid foundation for life, but to reach it, a leap of faith is required. He is famous for this idea. The point is that real faith is required, as opposed to the common, customary, half-hearted, lukewarm belief of most Christians already in the Danish society of his time, not to mention those in present-day Europe. The reason why a leap is required, and why it is a matter of faith at all, is that there is no rational justification for the belief. The whole point is that one has to simply make the choice without knowing. If you actually knew God existed, no such leap would be required. Of course, such an irrational leap of faith can lead one to fall into any kind of scam or dangerous cult. Had Kierkegaard been born in a different time and place, his choice of religion would likely have been different. On what grounds could one claim that the religion chosen without rational justification is the right one? Or does it not even matter? It could well be argued that Kierkegaard merely claimed his life experiences to be universal without much justification. Perhaps he falsely thought he had risen to the highest level only because that was his own level. What if he had later discarded religion? Would he then have claimed that actually it was the level 4, his then current level, that was the highest? Just because he had a certain kind of life career does not really sound like a good reason to think the same applies to everyone. In fact, it sounds very arrogant and naive to think so. Later existentialists have emphasized the different life choices of different individuals more. Friedrich Nietzsche, a student of Schopenhauer, stood against most, or perhaps all, of the philosophers of life before him. He celebrated will and welcomed suffering. Those were requirements for greatness, which to him was more important than anything else. To achieve anything of value, one must struggle, overcome one's own limitations, especially the lazy desire for complacency. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, Nietzsche claimed. Modern medicine would tend to disagree, but I suppose that old saying can work as encouragement. Creative life can be difficult, and one way to endure suffering and all the unpleasantness of life can be to take it all on heroically, like some romantic ideal knight. Creativity was important for Nietzsche, who not only appreciated it in art, required it in ethics as well. The point of life is to forge it into what you want it to be, taking charge instead of blindly following social norms and taking the easy way of following the consensus of the masses. Nietzsche was an extreme individualist, opposed to all forms of groupthink, religion, conservatism, nationalism, militarism, and the like. It was, of course, militarism, nationalism, and racism that caused previously unimaginable horrors in the 20th century, 2 world wars and the Holocaust. Even as communism motivated the Russians to overthrow the Tsar, the new Soviet empire they created was mostly a Russian project, with Russians spreading their own cultural dominance by military force. More recently, Russia has been doing the same without any pretenses. It was the experiences of especially the Second World War among Western Europeans that made existentialism popular, even among ordinary people. Among the existentialists of that generation was Albert Camus, who came to think that life is absurd and there is no great meaning of life. He still wanted to look for the small, important moments in life and keep on resisting the meaninglessness of everything. Jean-Paul Sartre is the philosopher most strongly associated with existentialism and also one of the most famous philosophers of modern times. He especially emphasized the freedom and responsibility of one's choice. He stressed that humans have the ability to act even against our instincts, unlike all other animals. This means we cannot help but be responsible for everything we do or fail to do. Following orders, like the German soldiers did under the Nazi regime, is no exception. Every single one of them was responsible for their part in the war crimes and the crimes against humanity. But also, truly making one's own choices is to live an authentic life. The price of this freedom and ability to be authentic to ourselves and to freely create ourselves is that this freedom causes anxiety. There are countless difficult choices to make and no one but ourselves to tell us what to choose. Thus, we create rules for ourselves in order to pretend not to have a choice. This is bad faith, mauvaise foi, inauthentic living. We could just be honest and resist the social norms or other pressures, but that is sometimes hard to do. One of the most well-known phrases of existentialism is "existence precedes essence." It states the stance against essentialism, such as Aristotle's idea of a human nature. Existentialists deny the reality of any determining essences, and instead assert that we first exist, are born, thrown into the world, and only then we can become something. We, in fact, create ourselves, our identities, by making choices. We choose what is important to us and what we want to be. Of course, we cannot change things like the color of our skin, but we can choose what those things mean to us. Martin Heidegger used the term Dasein, German for existence, to emphasize the contextuality of human life. We are not just somewhere, but here and now. The historical, social, cultural context of our own existence is important. It is what our understanding is tied to. We cannot build universal ethical theories, for example, because it is impossible to surpass our limitations. We can only strive to live authentically. Simone de Beauvoir is known as one of the most important feminists, but she was also an existentialist. She famously stated that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Gender is a social construction, not defined by the biological sex. For example, clothes rather weirdly express gender in many ways, such as from which side they are buttoned up. Of course, even the concept of biological sex is not a clear-cut issue, as has recently become common knowledge, despite conservative transphobes railing against such new ways of thinking. De Beauvoir also pointed out that woman is always the other, man being the default, the assumed gender. Existentialism is obviously not a strict philosophy of life that would provide you with easy answers to how to live your life. Quite the contrary. The problem with existentialism is that it seems to lead to relativism, which may be both impossible to defend rationally and also may be rather fruitless as a source for a philosophy of life. It apparently inspired literature, but I suspect the days of its great popularity are in the past. The problem for a person trying to choose a philosophy of life in the present world of late-stage capitalism and environmental catastrophe, with the dismal expectations for the future, including a renewed realism in the fear of nuclear annihilation, is that there is no easy answer. Even secular humanism is not quite the answer one might need, because there are so many different options under that umbrella term. I can only recommend an eclectic approach to go with, picking what seems useful in the philosophies of life I have introduced so far, especially Stoicism, as well as what else you may find compatible with what you have. This is all I can offer for now. I may return to the subject someday, but for this course, the next subject is going to be applied ethics. I hope you'll stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching. Bye! If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe, and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.